Research proposal presentation. Why I chose The Lady with the Dog. I chose The Lady with the Dog as the subject of my research paper for several different reasons. The first was that I found it interesting that it was broken into parts, as a novel might be, which is very typical of short stories. The distinction between parts gave the story a kind of dramatic feel, as if it were a play, without making it seem over-emotional or dramatic. I thought the setting of the piece was also very interesting, being in Russia, since Russia had a culture that was very different from our own at the time. The last thing that I found most intriguing was the way that Chekhov portrayed emotions in his characters. Contrary to many writers of the time, it wasn't embellished with long descriptions of their feelings, but instead was very straightforward. This made the more emotional parts of the story feel very real and in the moment, instead of being overly dramatic when compared to perhaps a scene of one of Shakespeare's tragedies. This also left a lot of the story open to interpretation by the reader, instead of being very obvious, which I think is a good thing for a short story. In conducting my research up to date, I began by researching more about the author and more about the story itself. I also found an article of well-known short stories from around the same time frame. My first article was by Marek H. Domenechik, called Physician Writers Anton Chekhov. It's a brief bibliography about the author. This article mostly discusses his career as a physician and how it contributed to his success as a writer. The author of this article states he's so successful about writing about the lives of human beings because he's a physician that can help you better understand the human condition. This source is connected to literary work because it discusses the author in detail, which can really help the reader understand Chekhov's writing style more, which might influence the way he writes about how he portrays certain elements in The Lady with the Dog. My second article is by Robert Fulford, and it's called Surprised by Love, Chekhov and the Lady with the Dog. This article is more of a literary analysis of the story, and it discusses how Chekhov's melancholy humor and tough writing style was very unique for his time and leaves a lasting impression on those who read many of his stories, but it mostly specifically discusses the lady and the dog. The author also discusses how The Lady with the Dog can be set in modern times and still be very applicable, something that might not be true of other stories written around the same time. This source is connected to The Lady with the Dog because it is not only discusses how the author's writing style and his contribution to literature, but also the impression that the lady with the dog leaves on readers. My third source is by Charles Stanion, and it's called Oafish Behavior, The Lady with the Pet Dog. This article discusses the emotional states of Chekhov's characters in the story, and it mostly discusses how Gurov's attitude toward women changed as the story goes on, and how he initially sees them as a diversion from married life until he falls in love with Anna and his attitude changes. The author believes that by analyzing such emotional transition as Gurov's can help the reader understand the simplicity by which Chekhov depicts emotions in his stories. And this article connects to literary work because it discusses the emotions of the characters in The Lady with the Dog and also Gurov's changing attitudes. My fourth article is called Gurov's Flight of Emotion in Chekhov's The Lady with the Dog, and is by Boyd Kreisman. It's analyzing the emotions of characters in The Lady with the Dog, similar to the previous source, but focuses more on outbreaks of emotion in the characters and specifically Gurov. It analyzes his two very strong emotional outbreaks, the one at Oreanda with Anna and the second at Medical Club in Moscow, and how these influence the story as a whole. He also states that these moments of emotional intensity can be seen in some of Chekhov's other stories, and says that studying them can help the reader understand Chekhov better as a writer. It also talks about short stories such as The Lady with the Dog have influenced the evolution of modern short story, because of Chekhov's realism and blunt portrayal of emotions of characters and his other stories. This source connects to the story because it discusses the emotions of characters in the story and also how the story has influenced modern short fiction. My last article that I found was called What Makes a Great Short Story Great by Thomas A. Gullison. And this article analyzes what makes a good short story. It organizes the stories by genre and time frame. It specifically mentions the writing styles of different short story authors such as Ernest Hemingway, Bret Harte, Stephen Crane, and Anton Chekhov. It discusses these authors and how their short stories have influenced modern short fiction and what elements of other stories were revolutionary at the time. It relates to The Lady with the Dog because it discusses the author Anton Chekhov's contribution to the development of the short story and even specifically uses elements from The Lady with the Dog as an example. How the articles relate to each other. All the sources relate to each other because they either discuss the author Anton Chekhov or specifically discuss different elements from Lady with the Dog, such as the characters and the time frame. The research I have done so far from these articles have given me a good idea of why the author writes like he does and his understanding of the human emotion. and how both of these factors influence the lady with the dog. Future research plans. To continue my research, I would like to read more about Chekhov's life, specifically his life in Russia and how that might have influenced his writing. Though this was touched on in the biographical article, I would like to research this more. I would also like to find more source material about Russian culture and the time to get a better idea of the social structure of men similar to Gurov in the story to help me understand his character better. Potential thesis. Based on my research up to date, I have decided to focus the argument of my research paper on the way that Chekhov writes about emotions in his story. This subject of writing interests me because Chekhov takes such an interesting approach when it comes to writing about human emotions. This is my working thesis right now. Chekhov's straightforward and embellished portrayal of emotions in The Lady with the Dog contributes to the feeling of authenticity in the story, making the characters both personable and relatable. Thank you.